Greetings, gremlins. Happy Monday. I guess it'll be Monday when I post this, right? We have a guest today, because why not? As always, I hope you guys are all safe and you are all healthy. I hope you're all going to bed at a reasonable time. I hope quarantine is treating you guys well. I myself am watching a lot of bad reality TV right now. Also, just so you know, I'm listening to all those songs that you guys recommended. And some of you have some pretty good music taste, so good job. Hey, real quick, moment we've all been waiting for. Here is the evilest Disney villain according to you guys. I do not agree with that, but I'm not in charge of this. You guys have spoken. I guess Scar is the evilest Disney villain. Did we ever figure out if evilist was a word? I can't remember. I'm not 100% sure what the next bracket is going to be, so make sure you answer that question on your bell ringer today so I know what to prepare for tomorrow. Here's a shout out for everybody who got their Crazy Horse quiz in by the time I was making this video. As always, thank you so much. Love you guys. I am so proud of you. Let's get going. Today's lesson is on the abolitionist movement. If you don't know what abolitionists are, abolitionist comes from the word abolish. What these people were trying to abolish was slavery. Today we are talking about some incredibly brave people who put their reputation, their families, and even their lives on the line to fight for what was right, which was obviously to get rid of this evil institution. So we have been talking about slavery since September. Slavery had been around in America since 1619. Almost as long as slavery had been around, there had been people around who were against slavery. But by the 1800s, even though most Americans were like against slavery in theory, they were really hesitant to get rid of it. They didn't see how they could get rid of it without Didn't see how they could get rid of it without just causing a lot more problems. And then of course there were these awful people who had no interest in getting rid of slavery, most likely because they profited off of human suffering. The abolitionists we are going to be talking about today started to change that. As these people started speaking out more, the abolitionist movement started picking up a lot of steam in the 1800s. It was centered in the North because a ton of people in the South wanted to keep slavery because it was so entrenched down there. As we go through these 6 abolitionists, pay attention to who you find the most interesting because for your assignment today, you're going to be making a trading card for one of these abolitionists. Don't worry, I'll explain more about that at the end of this video. I apologize in advance for my weird microphone voice, but let's get started. Here are 6 of the most important abolitionists in American history. First one up is a man named William Lloyd Garrison.
This is Garrison. So he was a journalist crusader. What that means is that his main weapon to use to fight against slavery was the press. Now he was a little different from abolitionists who had come before him. People before him had obviously wanted slaves to be freed, but they had thought that we needed to do it gradually so that we didn't cause all these infrastructure problems. But Garrison wasn't about that. He wanted immediate emancipation or freedom for the enslaved. He said, "This has gone on way too long already. We cannot do this gradually." So he was the founder of The Liberator, which was a famous anti-slavery newspaper, and he was also the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which would become one of the biggest abolitionist societies in the world. So clearly this guy was big on the abolitionist stage. He did not have an easy time once he became an abolitionist. He had to flee for his life a few times. He had effigies of him burned in front of his newspaper office, but he never gave up. And in total, Garrison published over 1,800 newspaper issues in his lifetime against slavery.
So the next guy we're going to talk about was actually someone that Garrison brought to the center stage for the abolitionist movement. His name is Frederick Douglass.
This is Frederick Douglass. Now, he was born into slavery, but he escaped in 1838. Eventually, he meets Garrison and others in the Anti-Slavery Society, and in 1841, he gave a moving speech at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. His speech was so powerful that the society asked Douglass to become an anti-slavery speaker for 3 years.
As Douglass was going around speaking, a ton of white Americans could not believe that somebody who was this well-spoken, this articulate, could have ever been enslaved. Back then, a ton of racist people said there was no way that African Americans could ever be citizens of the United States because they weren't smart enough. But Douglass was living proof against that. For the rest of his life, Douglass would continue to fight for equality, whether that was equality for races, for genders. Douglass's beliefs were summed up by this quote: "I would unite with anybody to do what is right and with nobody to do what is wrong." Before we get to our next person, let's go over what the Underground Railroad was. The Underground Railroad was not like a subway or some type of train that was underground. It was the code name given to a network of secret trails and safe houses that enslaved people would use to escape from the South to make their way to the North or to Canada. People who would help the enslaved escape were known as conductors. The next abolitionist is the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad.
Hopefully this name is familiar to you. Our next abolitionist is Harriet Tubman. Harriet was born into slavery, but Tubman escaped slavery using the Underground Railroad herself in 1849. She traveled over 90 miles to Philadelphia in the Free State of Pennsylvania. When she arrived, though, she wasn't satisfied. She decided to return to the South to help her loved ones escape as well. Even once her loved ones were safe, though, she still didn't feel like she was done. Tubman would return to the South 19 times to help over 300 other slaves escape to freedom. Every single time she did this, she risked her freedom and her life, and yet she kept going back to help more people.
Moses, as she was known, never lost a single passenger.
This is Dred Scott. He was born into slavery, and he lived in the free territory of Wisconsin with his enslaver for a time. Afterwards, he went to court to demand his freedom since he had lived in a free state. He was arguing, since I lived in a free state, that means that I am a free man. This was an extremely brave thing to do, especially because this was not going to be an easy journey. It took 10 years of court battles until the case went to the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court heard the case and made its decision, many people were disappointed by the result, because the Supreme Court ruled that any African American, whether they are free or enslaved, could not go to court and ask for their freedom because they were not considered citizens of the United States.
The Dred Scott decision is a perfect example of how the Supreme Court is not always right. This is honestly seen as one of the worst decisions the court has ever made. The Supreme Court had been trying to settle this issue once and for all, but instead it just caused massive outrage and deepening divides in the nation. Now, as for Dred Scott himself, you have to admire the guy for going to court, putting his life on the line to fight for his freedom. He did end up getting his freedom from another enslaver. Sadly, though, he died of tuberculosis just a few months after earning emancipation. Alright, moving on to our next abolitionist.
This woman is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a wife and a mother, and she ended up having a huge impact on the abolitionist movement. The way she fought against slavery was that she was an author, and in 1852 she published a novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin revolved around an enslaved man named Uncle Tom and other slaves that were on the plantation where he lived. This book was shocking. It exposed the cruelties of slavery and described enslavers as evil people who abused and tortured their slaves. This was an extremely graphic book, very hard to read, and yet many people did read it. It ended up being one of the most popular books of the century. So many people read it, and so many people were haunted and distraught over what they read that it ended up turning many people in the North into abolitionists. So people who had been kind of iffy on slavery and emancipation were suddenly like, no, this needs to end. I will not let cruelty like this go on any longer. But then on the other hand, you had people in the South, and they hated this book. Southerners were angered by Stowe's book. They felt attacked by the description of slavery. They argued that it wasn't accurate, and even those who knew that there were instances where it was accurate obviously didn't want that type of stuff getting out.
Uncle Tom's Cabin had such a big impact on America that at one point Stowe traveled to meet Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. And when they met, he looked at her and he said, "So you're the little lady that started this great war." Okay, our next abolitionist is a little different from the other people we've talked about. His name was John Brown, and if you're wondering why he was different, just look at this quote. "These men are all talk. What we need is action."
This is John Brown, and basically just to sum up how he was different than the other abolitionists is that he believed in fighting slavery physically, not just with words. So Brown would have numerous violent confrontations with people who were pro-slavery. We'll hear about some of those instances next week, but the most famous one happened in October of 1859. So John Brown led a group of abolitionists to attack a federal arsenal in Virginia. He was with 21 other men, 5 black and 16 white. So an arsenal is where you stockpile weapons. So him and his men were going there to steal these weapons to arm enslaved people in Virginia with, in the hopes of starting a slave uprising. They were not successful. They were captured, and John Brown was hanged for treason on December 2nd, 1859.
Brown is a very controversial figure to this day. There's basically 2 trains of thought. Was he this heroic martyr, or was he a terrorist? You decide. On to our final abolitionist, and she is one of my favorites.
Our final abolitionist is a woman named Sojourner Truth. She was born into slavery, but in 1827 she ran away from her enslaver and took refuge with an abolitionist family. She became free under a New York law that banned slavery.
Truth actually sued her former enslaver for custody of her son, and she ended up being one of the first black women to ever go to court against a white man and win.
In 1843, Truth experienced what she thought was a command from God to preach. She took the name Sojourner Truth and began to lecture on the abolition of slavery. She gave a really famous speech that you guys are going to listen to in just a couple days. After she visited President Abraham Lincoln, she stayed in Washington, D.C. and helped find jobs and homes for formerly enslaved people who had escaped from the South.
All these people, along with countless others that I didn't get to talk about, were incredibly admirable for their bravery and for their determination to stand up for what was right, even when it was dangerous to do so. Now what you guys need to do is go back and choose the person you found who was the most interesting, and you're going to make a trading card for them. So let me show you what I want that to look like real quick.
So once you have your abolitionist chosen, you're going to make like a trading card for them. So this would be the front of the card, this would be the back of the card. Go look up a picture of your abolitionist, and then you're going to copy and paste the picture of them right here. And then down here, you're going to erase this and type in their name. Then you can go back to the video, and I have the dates of their birth and their death just in the video, so you can just look that up. And then down here, you're just going to sum up how they fought against slavery. This does not need to be detailed. It can be a single sentence if you think that's enough for you. And voila, you are done, and you can submit.
I will put timestamps for the different abolitionists down in the description, so it's easier for you guys to go back and hear the stories about certain ones. I will be back tomorrow for another lesson. Oh, and thank you for subscribing. You guys make me laugh. I miss you, gremlin. Bye.